And we'll start by downloading the latest version of Blender. These assets are designed to be used with Blender 5.0. Got some functions that only Blender 5.0 has, so if you're working on a previous version of Blender, you'll likely need to upgrade to Blender 5.0. Otherwise, the assets may not behave as they should. So go to your browser of choice, do a search on Blender Download, and that should pop up for you. Click on the link and you should get to a page that looks like this. Ensure the version 5.0 is listed there, and just download Blender for your particular operating system. Install that and launch Blender. You should get a screen that comes up like this. If you just click on General, you'll see the default Blender configuration, which includes a cube, a camera, and a single light, along with the XY axes and the grid that represents the floor. Next step, if you haven't already, I've included a link to the Asset Pack 1 in the video description. Go ahead and download that file, store it wherever you want. Just go to the File menu and Open. Don't save on the default geometry there. Just navigate to where you downloaded that file and click on that and hit Open. And you should see something very similar to this. Right now, we don't have anything visible. Everything is hidden. And I want to walk through a little bit of the structure of the file before we get into any of the details here. So if we look at the overall layout of Blender, we have in the largest viewing area, we have a 3D viewport. We've got a couple of panels at the bottom. Don't have to worry about either of those right now. You can actually minimize those if you want. If you see the border of the 3D viewport, you hover over that horizontal border until you get that white double arrow, and then you can just bring all of that stuff straight down. If you want to bring it back up, you can do that. This is true of each of the sub-windows in Blender. So you see we have one sub-window here, actually that contains two. We have a vertical border that we can slide back and forth. I just want to get that out of your way. The two panels we want to leave up, in addition to the 3D viewport, are the Scene Collection panel, and just below it is the modifiers panel. Now you see in Scene Collection, this is a hierarchy of everything that's included in the file. The modifiers panel is actually just one of many that you can go through here. If you don't know anything about Blender at all, I'd encourage you to do some searching on YouTube for some basic tutorial videos that at a minimum show you how to navigate and how to work through the user interface of Blender. But even if you don't do that, I hope to give you enough information here in this video to be able to start creating your custom-made sets with my asset packs. But the main tools we'll be using to do this is the viewport and then the modifiers tab in this window on the lower right. So to give you a tour through all of this, I just have three high-level categories in my hierarchy. One is top-level objects. That's simply a couple of cameras and the sun, and we can turn items on and off using these eyeball icons. And if we click on something in the upper hierarchy, it impacts everything below, and you can individually turn on items below, off and on. Now there are two different visibility settings here, and I'm going to actually go directly to Assets and turn on my Asset Showcase, which we see here. So as I said, there are two different visibility icons here. One is what you see in the viewport, and you can turn that on and off. The other icon just to the right of it is a camera icon, and this icon enables or disables the objects in renders, so you can turn that on and off. You won't see any immediate change in the screen. It only impacts, again, what you see in renders. I'll give you an example of that. So say I want to render this view here. First thing I have to do is I use a shortcut key to go to the camera view, and that's using numpad 0. This is the camera view. I've got it set to follow any kind of navigation that you want to do here, so you can zoom in and zoom out on stuff, and the camera view will follow that right along. A couple of quick notes on some quick shortcuts, and I'll be talking about shortcuts as we work through the video here. To zoom in on any object, all you have to do is highlight that object. So say I want to click on this red alert way back here, and then I hit the numpad period, and that'll zoom in on that object in the viewport. Now the neat thing is too, if I highlight an object in here, and if I hit that numpad period, when I'm hovering over the hierarchy, the outline over here on the upper right, it'll zoom into that item in the hierarchy, and it'll highlight that for you. So this is a keyboard shortcut I use all the time. I'm constantly using this just to quickly zoom in and identify where things are, either in the outline or in the viewport. Okay, so let's say we want to render this view. We've got our camera lined up. We've got our asset camera turned on, meaning that it will be visible in renders. If we don't have that on, and you can see all of the other cameras below it go dim, and we go up to render image, this is what we get, just a gray panel, because there's literally nothing to render. We haven't told it to render anything at all. If I turn that camera back on, in the upper right corner, now you see everything below it is turned on, and everything below you can individually control on and off down to the object level. So now that everything's turned on, visible in the render, you can once again to render image, keyboard shortcut F12, and then it will render that image. It takes a few seconds to do that. Gives you a progress report on the amount of time, how much time is estimated to remain, and how many samples that it's taken. You can change all of those parameters in the settings. I won't be going into that in this video though. And it's done. So that's what your render looks like. And we'll minimize that for now. We'll get out of camera mode by hitting numpad 0 again. And I'll just go through my different folder structures here. Again, under assets, I've got an asset showcase here, which is intended to show each asset and an example of how it might be used in a given scene. Then below that, I've got the assets grouped into different folders here. Now, when you're making your particular scenes, you shouldn't necessarily have to go into these folders. But I just want to show you the structure I've got here. So we've got a big red push button, and I'm going to highlight that and hit my numpad period, and it'll zoom way in on that. So another point here is that you may notice that some assets in particular look like they're pretty low polygon. In this case, we can see it's not a perfect circle. It's more of a polygon here with flat edges. And that's intentional. That's to minimize the impact on your computer during normal operation. If I switch to a camera view, and Blender's really good at this, you can tell it to have a certain amount of detail in your viewport. If I want to render that, make sure I got my rendering camera set to render that big red button. And if I render that thing, you can see it's got a nice round appearance now, and it renders it to a higher number of polygons than what's available in the viewport. All right, numpad 0 again to get out of the camera view. So I've got a folder for button switches and knobs, crew quarters, elevators, floors. I've only got one primitive in here, a cube primitive, screens, a hex screen, circle screen, square screen, walls and beams, and wall widgets. So this is where I store the finished assets. And again, you shouldn't necessarily have to go into this folder hierarchy at all. What you do want to do is bring up this bottom couple of windows here, and we can make one of these big. If we click on the upper left icon in any window, you can select what you want that window to represent. In this case, we want an asset browser. And now I have my asset browser. Now this is a much more user-friendly version with drag and drop capability that shows all of the assets in this file. If I click on the top level of the hierarchy called geometry, it'll show you every asset that I have stored in this file. And then I also have them categorized. I've got all of the categories, future and current, in here. So a lot of these are empty right now, but they'll be filling up as I release more asset packs. So on the bridge folder, for example, I've got nothing yet. Button switches and knobs, I just have 2 buttons so far, and so on and so forth. With this first asset pack, we're mainly dealing with walls and beams. You see all of those here. Wall widgets, you see what I've got there, and flooring. There's just one asset for flooring, and you can modify that to whatever shape and size you want that to be. So that's the asset folders. You can pretty much just hide that away from renders and the viewport and forget it exists. But if you do want to get in there and see how the sausage is made, you can go in here and take a look at all of these things. I'll give you one example. So walls and beams, for example. If we switch from asset pack here to geometry node editor, which I spend a lot of time in, but hopefully you shouldn't have to unless you really want to do that. If I go into walls and beams and I click on my orthogonal wall asset here, gotta make sure that's visible. Okay, so I've got my orthogonal wall here. If I zoom out, it should show up. There it is. So you can see my wall. If you really want to dig in again to see how the sausage is made here, you can get into the geometry node aspect of this thing and see all of the operators that make up this wall. All of this is in order to give you a user-friendly panel to modify parameters. In this case, wall geometry and different aspects of that wall. So this, ideally, I've made this asset pack to allow you to spend most of your time just in the modifier properties window to modify those assets and put them where you want them to go and make them look how you want them to look. So again, we'll hide the assets for now, pretend like they're not even there. The third thing I have is the stage 9 layout. I want to open that up. Now everything you see here was created with asset pack 1. And the reason I started with walls and floors is because it covers quite a bit of what's in the stage 9 layout. So I've got some things that I need to tweak here and there, but I'll get that done as we walk through this. So we got floor segments here. We can have arched floors, linear floors. I actually used a floor segment with some Boolean operators on it to create this rough placeholder for a transporter pad. We can also use the floor asset to create these floor strips that we see down here. And then of course we have the corridor walls and different wall widgets throughout that corridor. So I'm going to collapse each of these items here. And I like to stay organized with so many models, even in just the stage 9 set. You can very quickly lose track of how things are organized, where they are, unless you create some kind of folders, containers to store that stuff and keep things organized. And again, you can look up some basic Blender tutorials on the Blender UI to figure out how to do that. I will give you an overview of that. If we want to create a new collection, that's what these file cabinet looking things are here. Say you want to create your own set. You want to blank out stage 9 and create your own set. And you can just right click on that scene collection up here and hit new collection. It creates a new collection for you and numbers that. So we've got 3 collections already. It's calling this collection 4. Double click on that and say my set. And within here, you can create some other collections. and sub-collections, and then start dragging your assets into the scene and putting them in this hierarchy however you see fit. And that's one way you can organize things. I'm going to delete that for now. Show stage 9 here. So you see I've got stage 9 split up into blueprints and then split up into the different areas of stage 9, the briefing room, brig, corridors, crew quarters, engineering, medical, and transporter room. And I have subfolders under each of those to further organize all of that stuff. Blender will give you a count of how many objects, that's the upside down orange triangle, how many lights, shown with the light bulb, and how many collections are within each of those collections there. I'm going to hide everything right now, except for the blueprints. I've included 3 different blueprints in here as kind of a starter. If you want to lay something on top of these blueprints, they are scaled appropriately to the size of the assets I have. These are actual stage 9 layouts. I've got one that's from Journey to Babel. We'll hide that. And these work the same way as every other asset. If I have the camera turned on here, that will show up in a render. So if you don't want your blueprint showing up in a render, you can just click on the high level camera to turn all blueprints off. Or if you want to control individual ones, you can do that as well. We've got Charlie X in here. And then finally, the blueprint from Balance of Terror. I'll hide the blueprints. Got the briefing room. Again, so far only walls and floors and some wall widgets. So that's why we don't see the briefing room table in there. Stage 9 brig, not much to that right now. And the corridors, which we see here, we see kind of like looks like a grin with a tooth out of it here. And this is because in the crew quarters, I make the corridors directly outside the crew quarters, part of the crew quarters, part of the central wall asset. Right here, I've got a toggle set wrong. So right now this is set to be a straight wall. Correct this on the fly here. Corridor walls off and on. And I've got it set to linear right now. I just need to uncheck that box. And it snaps to radial walls with everything lined up properly. So again, that's why we see that gap in here on these corridor walls here. We unhide the crew quarters. That fills right up. Not much in engineering yet. Engineering is a very detail-intensive asset pack. I have all of those assets created, but I'm going through each one of those one by one and rebuilding them basically from scratch to make sure they're the best they can be. But I do have the main rear wall here with the hex grid shown here. And medical, again, the main walls in medical. And you can do quite a bit with just walls and doors and a few wall widgets. So with these tools, I can create the holes in the walls for shelves that we'll be putting in later, for doors, for coves defined here, computer display screens, and other things like that. And then finally, the transporter room. This is a good example of how we can use 2 different colors for any given wall. We can have the wall be a single color or one color on one side and a different color on the other side. So that's stage 9. I encourage you to go through here, look at it, click on particular assets. You'll see it highlight. Hit the period key as you hover over the outline. You can see it in the outliner. And then you can investigate and experiment with the different settings in the modifiers panel in order to see how that thing was put together. So now what I'm going to do is go through each of these assets individually to show how they work. I think we'll start with walls and beams. Now I covered this a lot in my initial video I did. Oh my, it's been 7 months ago now, I think. I'd encourage you to go back and look at that video. So not gonna cover everything in all of that detail again, but focus mainly on the new stuff. So let's start with something kind of fun. I think the J-beam assembly from the briefing room is neat to look at and fun to work with. Now, how we use assets with this asset pack is you just drag an asset from the asset browser into your viewport. You can drag it anywhere, but all of these assets are designed so that the origin of the assets, that's that little orange dot right here, is at 0, 0, 0 point in your viewport. So the first thing I'm going to do is hit the N key. See, that toggles the sidebar on the right off and on. I'm going to click on item and change my location of this asset to 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and leave it there. Now, if you're doing multiple decks, you want to give that a Z dimension. Say my next deck up is 120, that's 10 feet tall, plus the 27 inches of the deck thickness, and that's how they would look there. So with the J-beams, you have all of the location, orientation, and array modifiers that you had as I described it in my first video. I'm not going to go through these in detail again. Suffice it to say, you can modify the radius of an asset. Oops, not 100,000. The start angle, the resolution, and the sweep angle. That's all for radial type assets that are defined with polar coordinates. You can grab a value with the mouse, click and hold, and then scroll left and right to modify that value. Or you can click in the field and type in a value if you want to be more precise. And this location, orientation, and array set of controls is identical for almost every asset that's in this asset pack. So you should always see that at the very top. After location, orientation, and array, which locates the asset, then you have various, below that are the modifiers that control size, shape, appearance, color, everything else having to do with that asset. So in this case, I've got some modifiers for the J-beam itself, so I can control the length of the beam, again by holding down the left mouse button over that value and scrolling left and right, or I can type in a number. I've got a thickness scale. If you want to change that, it defaults to 1. It should be what we saw on screen. Outer rim rooms where you want to have some beefy structure shown there, you can do that. I've got a toggle for single and double decks, so they span 2 decks instead of just 1. And this is really designed to be on the outer edge of the primary hull. If you want to put these out there, the rec rooms that Jimbo Titus has designed in his blueprints, I've used these J-beams in those rec rooms on the outer rim of decks 6 and 7 on the primary hull. And of course, the colors you can change as well. Now the color controls are also pretty identical from one asset to the next. You've seen what I did here. I switched viewing modes, and I'll make a little break here to talk about the different viewing modes in Blender. Across the upper right corner of the viewport, you see these different spheres here that represent the different viewing modes that we have. But going even further left than that, we can turn various things on and off. Starting with this arc and the arrow, that's to show the gizmos on and off. That'll show your X, Y, and Z axis. As we rotate around here, it shows the direction and orientation of those axes. You can click and drag on the magnifying glass to zoom. You can click and drag the hand to pan. You can toggle the camera view with this icon, and it shows you the numpad shortcut for that. And then you can switch the current view from perspective to orthographic. like so. I normally have those off, but you may find it helpful to have those turned on. And that further breaks down into you can select what's available or not available with the drop-down menu. For now, I'm going to turn those off. This next item is the overlays. This shows things like the grid floor, the X and Y axis in the viewport, and the origin. So we can turn various individual things on and off. And if we want to just turn the whole set on and off, we can click that icon there. One of the things I use most often is the Object Extras checkbox, and that turns the icons for the lights on and off. Once we start populating a model with lights, they can quickly look very cluttered in there, so you want the ability to toggle those on and off. I'll give you an example. In stage 9, turn stage 9 on. We'll hide our J-beam assembly here. If we turn extras on, you can see all of these lights in here, which is good if you need to work with the lights. But if you don't want to work with the lights and you just want to see how your scene is coming together, you want to be able to turn those off. Now, turning them off does not impact how they light up the scene. It just turns off the icon for each one of those. Okay, we'll go back to our J-beams here, and I can change the color of those. We've got the main color, which we can modify. And the color setting will give you a pre-selected menu of colors that are commonly used in the sets. But you also have the abilities to select custom here. If you just can't find quite the color you want, you select custom, and it will add a custom color bar in your modifier area. You can click on that, and you've got a standard RGB, red, green, blue, hue, saturation, volume, color mixer here, and you can just create any color that you want using that tool, using the custom color. You can also control the finish from flat to semi-gloss to glossy. This also has a custom finish as well. So if we go flat, you can see the impact of that. And let me go to the big red button again to show that, because this is a better example of the different finishes we can apply. So in this case, with the big red button, I've got it set to plastic. I've got the color set to red, but we can again pick any color we want. And the plastic finish, we can make it flat, semi-gloss, which shows some highlights there on the edges from the lighting reflection, and then glossy, which shows a very sharp highlights there. We can also set a custom finish from 0, very glossy, all the way up to 1, completely flat. So every color selection works in the same way. Select your color, select a custom color, select your finish, and select custom finish. The gloss doesn't really show up on these beams much because they're mainly flat, geometrically flat, that is. And then we can control this filler color up here independently. We can make that whatever color we want in the same exact way. Also with these beams, we can add the arced ceiling beam. We can toggle that on and off, and that's positioned as it is on the stage 9 blueprint, and it automatically adjusts itself as I change my sweep angle and start angle. It just brings each of those individual elements together with that one common beam that arcs throughout all of those. And we can toggle that on and off. And if we expand on that menu item, we can see the settings for that. The resolution factor is simply how many straight edges are used to make up that entire arc. And here I'll continue with the viewport settings up here that we had. So if you click on wireframe, that can be used in conjunction with this X-ray mode. If we turn X-ray off, it shows these as solid objects. If we turn X-ray on, we can see through everything. So this wireframe mode is good to highlight this arced beam. You see it's pretty chunky right now. It's divided into pieces to approximate a curve. And the resolution factor, we can raise and lower that to increase or decrease the resolution. The higher that goes, the smoother it'll look, but the more polygons that we have. So it's all a trade-off between computer performance and how you want your final render to look. So that's there as a slider because you may have something that goes 360 degrees and you want to be able to control how many polygons you're having to deal with when you render this out. So that's why that's a setting. The next viewport shader we have is solid, and this is also impacted by the X-ray icon. That's if you just want to look at the shape of things without having to be distracted with colors, materials, and textures. Again, with X-ray on, X-ray off. Then we have material preview, which is what I use most of the time. This is a pretty fast way to represent all of your assets and all of the colors and textures that they have. If you want to see how things will look in the final render, you click on this final rendered viewport shading mode and it will show that. So this takes a little bit more time to update every time you move your viewpoint, but it should be a pretty close approximation of what that final render will be. So that's the J-beam assembly. We'll highlight that and hit the delete key to delete it. If you delete an object that was brought into your scene, it does not delete the original asset. Your original assets are all stored in this asset collection up here. You know what? I'm going to bring those right back out again. I'm going to select my top scene collection, bring those out, and have that right there, and set the location to 0, 0 again, because the next asset I want to talk about is this angled panel. Now, the reason I picked this top scene selection before bringing those out is anytime you drag an asset out, it'll be added to whatever collection you have highlighted. So if we delete those, if I have, for example, stage 9 highlighted and it is currently not visible, and I bring my asset into the viewport, they disappear. And you wonder what happened. Well, you can see, you get a clue where there's a faint highlight in the stage 9 collection in the objects, and it's showing you that something is selected in here. So if you remember our trick with numpad period, if I hover over the hierarchy here and I hit the numpad period, I can see that J-beam assembly was dropped right into that collection because it was active at the time I brought it into the viewport. I can just click and hold and drag it to the top level scene collection, and it brings that out into the top level. So something you want to be aware of when you're bringing your assets out to save yourself a little bit of effort later on. Make sure the appropriate collection is highlighted before you drag your asset out. I'm constantly making that mistake, so I hope you do better than me there. So I brought that asset out. I set it to 0, 0, 0, and now I'm going to bring in my angled panel out. It's designed to be used in conjunction with the J-beams, and I'm going to do the same thing there. I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to set it to 0, 0. I'm going to take a look at my J-beam assets just to see where I place them with my parameters. So I've got a radius of 800. So initially I'm going to set this one out using polar coordinates, or the radius of 800, and that gets it not far from where I want it to be. So now is where the tweaking begins with placing things. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail because I went into this in my first video from 7 months ago, but I would tweak the start angle here, increase the radius until that's where I want it. And I'm using all kinds of keyboard shortcuts for the view here. On the number pad, we can go to the top view, front view, right side view with number pads, 7 for top view, 1 for front view, and 3 for right side view. If you don't have a number keypad, I recommend turning on your widgets and clicking on the Z for top view, Y for, what would that be, the right view, and X for front view if you want to do that same thing. So here I would center my piece between those two J-beams, go down to the geometry modifier, change the width of that, and then back to location orientation and an array. I want this to be an array. I don't need to put an additional piece here. I can just use this first one and say I want 2 of those, and I want the sweep angle to be such that it places that just in the right spot. And there we have that. I'm going to switch to rendered view here because that shows off the lighting a little better than the material preview. And you can see I've got a subtle glow in these panels here that we often saw in the briefing room, and that color would change depending on what scene was being shot. So if I click on this asset, collapse my location orientation and array, I can not only only change the width there. I can change, again, the paint color, the trim color, and I can turn that accent glow on and off. I can modify the glow color. I don't have any pre-selected colors here simply because this is lighting, and I just want to give you the freedom to choose any color you want to be that highlight back there. You can change the glow strength anywhere from 0 all the way up. I don't think I have any top level limit. Let's test that with 10,000. Yeah, it's you can blow that completely out. But less is more in this case, so you can usually go with a fairly low number there. Okay, I'm going to delete those two. Before I do that, though, thinking how would this work with the orthogonal layout? So say you had something like this on the secondary hull, and you had each of these not radially positioned, all pointing towards the center point, but stacked more in an orthogonal way. So we do that with, going back to location, orientation, and array. Don't have a radius necessarily. We'll have an X offset, a Y offset, and a Z offset. I'm going to set the radius to 0. We won't have a resolution here. This is the polar resolution. I'm going to change that to 1. If we change it to 0, all of them go away. We don't have any instances, so we always need at least 1 in here. Sweep angle, we can ignore that. So what I want to do now is set my X offset to, let's say, 850. That puts that out there. And now I want to have a Y count and a Y offset. So say I want to have 3, let's say 4 of these, and a Y offset of 150. So this would give us a squarish type of rec room or briefing room that you might see on, say, the secondary hull or some orthogonal type of layout. And I do the same thing with this angled panel here. I take away the radius, take out the start angle or 0 it out, change my resolution to 1. Sweep angle is only activated when you have a resolution of 2 or more. Reference my X offset here, 850. I'll click on my angled panel here and give it a same X offset to fit appropriately. We have, these things are spaced at 150 in the Y offset. So my width on this thing in my geometry drop down should be 150, and that should then match exactly. And if I give this piece a Y offset of 75, half of 150, it should put it right in between those first two. Then all I've got left to do is set up the orthogonal pattern, my Y count of 3 and my Y offset of 150, and it finishes that out. All right, delete both of those. To the corridor ceiling dividers, just drop that off there, 0 out the location. And this is designed to be at the right height, again assuming 10-foot tall corridors from floor to ceiling. The top of this panel is at 120 inches. I've updated this panel to be more screen accurate. You can see how it's inset here and a little bit thicker than what I had in the previous iteration. And that's just a radius and the start angle. And I said this in my previous video, but I'll say it again here. I avoid using arrays with this asset because the pattern for these conduits down here are set by the radius and start angle. So if I change the radius, you can see it cycle through randomly different patterns on those conduits. Likewise, if I change the start angle, it does the same thing, cycles through different patterns on those conduits. But if I set up an array, if I make 5 of those with a sweep angle, it does 2 strange things. One thing is that it maps this pattern across all of these instances, this moire pattern here, and you can see it get distorted as I change that sweep angle, distorted to an unacceptable level. I want to be able to fix this in a future release, but right now that's the way it is. So the other thing that it does is that it maintains the same exact conduit pattern on each one of these conduits, because this array creates identical copies of the original asset, and I want those to be different, not only with the conduits, but this moire pattern either is displayed or not displayed from one instance to another. So what I typically do there is not have an array. I will duplicate the asset with another keyboard shortcut I use quite often, just to, instead of dragging another copy of that asset out here again, I'll just click Shift D on my keyboard. It creates a duplicate of that right away. And if I right click it, it drops it right on top of the original. So now I've got one on top of the other there. So if I change the start angle of this next one, you can see It's got a slightly different conduit color setting. And then I can turn off that moire pattern independently of it being part of a larger array. These cylinders you see throughout the series, and I've got these plain white corner cylinders built into a lot of my walls so that you don't have to add those independently. But if you do need some kind of conduit, that you can just drag that out into the viewport and click on the checkbox that says conduit parameters. So it goes from a plain white conduit to a parametrically controlled conduit where you can have up to 4 different colors of bands with different spacings on there. If I turned all of these off, I can change the color of my main conduit. Again, same type of color controls as with everything else. I can have a custom color or one of the predefined conduit colors. Under the geometry portion of the panel, I can change the diameter of that, the length, and the resolution from a very fine resolution to essentially a triangle. And again, this is adjustable because you want to balance between what is visually looking good and how much work your computer has to do. I usually get by on this one with 16. And you could start adding the different colored bands that make up your conduit. You can look at a screen capture as reference and follow that. So with each band, you have control over the color, the thickness, and the location of that band. Starting off with band 1, bands 2, 3, and 4 are all located off of the previously numbered band. So band 2, if we turn that on, we set that color to red, we set it to whatever thickness we want, and its location is based off of not the bottom of the cylinder like band 1, but band 1 itself. The reason for that is if we move band 1, everything else goes along with that. And you can see I moved that down far enough that you could see how it repeated up here. The repeat pattern is set up at the top level conduit parameters heading. We can set the band repeat multiplier. If we just want one set of bands, we just have that set to 1, change that to 2, 3, 4, whatever number we want, and then the repeat distance is here. So this is nice for repeating pattern settings. And bands 3 and 4 are done in the same way. You see band 3 has a gap there because I have a location that separates it from the previous 2. You can also add negative locations there. But if it changes in one instance of that pattern, that changes in all instances. So I found with this system, I can pretty much replicate just about any conduit that we see on screen. If you find one that you're not able to create, let me know, and I'll see if I can get the asset updated to allow for that. This next item is the vertical stepped beam. Not a very creative name, I know, but it's something that we see in different areas of the sets. It looks kind of like this. We see it in some instances of the transporter room, and we see it also used as a divider in the upper level of the engineering room. So this is pretty simple. Other than the location orientation array functions, I have the geometry modifiers just control this basic geometry of the size and shape of the profile of this beam. So step 1 depth, and you can just experiment with these to get the look you're looking for. With all of these settings, you should be able to come up with something that to your eye looks as screen accurate as possible. And of course a height setting. Paint color, as with the rest, is fully customizable. All right, orthogonal wall. And I'd refer you to the video I did previously to go through most of the settings on this. I want to just highlight the changes that I made since that video. I now have a 2-color option. We'll go with the wall geometry breakout here, where we control the length, the thickness, and the height. I've got a checkbox for 2-color option, which then enables these grayed out this grayed out color selector down here. So if I have a wall, which is one color on one side, a different color on the other side, and I'll change that. I'll take out the wall trim just to focus on the wall color. So wall color is controlled with this color drop down. But if I have a room on the other side that I want a different wall color on, I'll go to check this 2-color checkbox here, and now that opens up this second color selector here. So I can make that white on one side and teal gray on the other. or any color you want that to be. I don't remember if I had floor skirting be a toggle in the previous video or not, but you can toggle that floor skirting on and off. I've noticed in some of the rooms they have floor skirting. In the corridors, for example, floor skirting is pretty much always on, but in some of the rooms they take those walls all the way down to the floor. Another new thing here, before I think all you could change was the wall length. So since they're 10-foot tall sets from floor to ceiling, I didn't think it was necessary to change the height of a wall and also the thickness of a wall. But there are some cases where you want to do that. So we can change that wall thickness to be ridiculously skinny where the inlay shows through. The standard screen accurate 12 inches thick, or in some cases you might have some special needs where you have a thicker or a thinner wall, and you can adjust that now. Also the wall height. So engineering is a good example of where we want to have a higher wall than we would otherwise have. I don't think I've got an upper limit on that. Try 10,000. Yeah, no upper limit on that. So the so-called standard height is 120 inches. That's 10 feet tall. Now, I did cover something else in a follow-up video, the deep dive into the crew quarters. I covered the corner cylinders that are built in there. So if this wall comes up to a corner with another wall, you can turn that corner cylinder on and off, and that breaks out into the individual corner cylinders at the start of the wall. You see here on the right hand side and the end of the wall on the left hand side. And depending on where the adjoining wall is coming in, if it's coming in from the bottom in this view, that's where you want that cylinder to where the radius of the cylinder is pretty much tangent to the flat part of the wall. But if the wall is coming in from the top in this view, you want it to be on the other side. So you can change that inboard outboard toggle to modify where that cylinder is. And this is also that you don't have to drag in a separate cylinder asset and position that separately from your wall asset. Something else new is that the inlay, just like with different colors on one side or the other, you may want to have the inlay displayed on both sides of the wall, only the inboard side, and the other side just no inlay at all, or only the outboard side. Both sides is a default. You also, and again we see this in engineering, we can see on a particularly tall wall, sometimes we see some horizontal inlay, so that's another checkbox that you can enable. Right now I just support the single horizontal inlay. We can change the height of that inlay, and then we can also indicate whether we want the vertical inlay to stop at that horizontal inlay height. That as well is controlled with the both sides, inboard or outboard drop down, and the default for that is off, horizontal inlay. I think I did cover the hole in the wall in that first video. We can toggle that on or off. We can make that inboard or outboard, control the width, height, depth, location, bevel size, and the cutout color as well. A minor quality of life update to the doors. We'll open up that door section here, turn doors on and off. Turns on and off not only the door, but the door chime if you have that included. We can indicate whether this is a double door or a single door. So here's the addition. I've updated the slide direction toggle. So on a single door, if we give it a slide factor, it slides one direction. Before, I had that set to where if you went to a negative number, it would slide the other way. But then we have different door widths, so that slide was actually the dimension of how much it slid, and that would change depending on your door size. Well, to make things quicker, I just wanted it to be a factor from 0 to 1. 0 representing all the way closed, 1 being all the way open, and you can just click and drag that and slam to one side or the other to quickly open or close that door. So a 0.5 would be halfway open. And if I want to change the direction that that door goes, I click on the slide direction toggle, and now my door slides in the other direction. If I don't want any door, click on opening only. There's no sign of a door there. And the other factors I think are all the same: location, height, width, thickness, and color on that. Underneath the door section, we also have a door chime. I think by default it shows up 3 inches distant from one edge of the door opening. You can change whether you want that inboard or outboard, and also to the left or the right of the door, and then control the horizontal location and vertical location of that. That's all the updates to the orthogonal wall. The radial wall also went through some updates. The main change to the radial wall is that it is controlled with a width dimension in inches rather than an angle. So these radial walls are actually kind of like pie wedges. We can see that if we look at the top-down view. And the reason for this is to give a consistent inlay spacing from one wall panel to the next. So if I take a look at the width I have now, I've got a width of say 90 here. Say I want to change that to 48. If I change the radius before, it would get bigger as I move that outboard because the angle from the center would radiate outward as it got further from the center. Now it maintains its width. All it does is change the angle of attack on these end pieces here. As I bring in the radius here, that angle becomes steeper and steeper, and it's overlapped to where that inlay is. Let's hide the door for a second. Let's put the inlay, extend that outward, distance from door, extend that outward a bit so that we have just a wall panel with the inlay here. Again, as before, you can turn the inlay on and off. The inlay as well, the width adjustment of that inlay is measured not with an angle as before, but with an inch thickness. So I set it to 0.75. The reason for that number is that as I make my circular array, let's give this a radius of 300, 48-inch wall panel. I want an end-to-end array resolution of whatever I want it to be. And I can, again, click and hold and drag that out to create a full 360 degrees if I wanted to. But the nice thing about this end-to-end array checkbox is that it figures out automatically how wide that wall is and automatically adds the next wall at just the right spot to line up with the previous one. If I go into wireframe here, they're butted up end to end. If I turn off the inlay, that does not change that because the inlay setting is still set to 0.75. If I change that to 0, now they butt up right up against each other. We've got 0.75 on one side, 0.75 to the other. We end up with a inlay width of 1.5 inches there. Just writing myself a note, a good point for an update would be, if I uncheck that inlay, would be to automatically zero out that width adjustment so that I don't have to do that manually. So with the radial wall, if we don't want to have an end-to-end array, say we want to have 3 or 4 doors equally spaced around the primary hall, we uncheck the end-to-end array. We want a resolution of, let's say, 4. We want a door in there and modify the sweep angle appropriately. In other words, it works just like the regular array does in other assets. The other setting that we have here is to start the angle from the end of the wall instead of the center. It defaults to the center of the wall. I find that is best for locating doors where you want to center a doorway on top of a blueprint. But if I'm creating another set of walls that will butt up against this one. So if I duplicate that, right click, change my start angle, I'm going to change my resolution to 1, set the second wall to an end-to-end array, and turn off the door. So now I have another door panel there. I want to start that door panel from the end of the wall, change the start angle there, and then using an end-to-end array, I'm going to give it a resolution to bring it over to this other wall. So what we run into, it's not uncommon that the array here doesn't quite line up with the next doorway that you have. So I'm going to decide, do I want 5 panels here or 6? 6 panels would be a little bit narrower than what we see here. 5 panels, each one would be a little bit wider. I'm going to go with 6. And then all I have to do, since I have this set to start at the end of this wall, all I have to do is change the width of the wall under geometry, and it will keep this point, the starting point, right where it's at. So if you keep your eye where my cursor is right now, as I change the width down, it keeps that point right where it's at. And all I have to do is zoom in on this other end, and modify that width to line up there. Now, if I didn't have this toggle start angle from end of wall, if everything started from the center of the wall, I would locate my first segment appropriately, a start angle of whatever it is to line up there. And then if I needed to adjust the wall width, it adjusts each wall width from the center, starting with that first wall. So now I change that width. You can see it pulls away from that starting location. So that's the main reason why you would want to click on that box. It's a subtle thing, but it makes life so much easier when you're setting up walls that are joined, that are butted up against each other. So experiment around with those settings and until you're comfortable with those. And these walls should go in pretty easily for you. All right, I think that covers the radial walls there. I have a wall with Cove. We see these quite often in sick bay and the briefing room and other types of rooms that has a wall with a door and located with it. I think, well, this is just the Cove, so it's designed to be used in conjunction with a wall. You can control the thickness of the Cove, the width, the height, of course, and the color. So on the Cove cutout, you can turn that on and off. If you turn it off, all you have is a cube, essentially. So we can change the offset of the Cove, X direction, Y direction, and Z. But I typically leave those alone. Change the height of the Cove, the opening width, and the depth. Now, what I didn't have in here before that I added is whether or not this Cove is symmetrical. So when it's symmetrical, when it's checked like this, I can change the angle of that flare. If I uncheck symmetrical, now I have two angle controls open up to me. One controls one side, the other controls the other side. And then, of course, material and finish settings as well. Last one under walls, we have wall with screen. This, I just did not have this asset before, and I was getting tired of putting in a wall, adding a hole to the wall, and then putting a separate asset of a screen and lining that up precisely with the hole that I had added. Well, now what we have is an asset that adds the screen automatically and keeps that hole size and the screen size aligned. We can also choose between a circle screen or a hex screen. So all of the interesting settings are under the screen heading. Everything else is the same as a standard wall. The corner cylinders, the trim. I don't think I have the door option in here. I should just delete that. Inlay or no. And so we've got the screen or no screen. So I don't know why you would want that unchecked, why you would drag in a wall with screen here and uncheck the screen, but we have that as an option. So there you go. And we can choose between a circle and a hex screen, just with a toggle. We can change the detail of the mesh from low, just to give you an approximation of what's supposed to be there, to medium, to high. And again, this is a trade-off between computer performance and what you want to see in the render. I usually leave this on low until I'm ready to render, and then I change it to high. Change the location horizontally, vertically. We can change the width and the height of that. Now, something new I didn't have before was the number of divisions here. So with the sick bay version of this, we have actually two different screens, or two screens put one on top of the other. We could change the number of vertical divisions to 1, and it would just be one uninterrupted screen. Could click on that to increase that to 3 or more, and it updates it automatically. I think I have a top limit of 5. Same thing with horizontal. We can have a number of divisions there, and we see the horizontal divisions in engineering with a tall wall and the hex screen with 3 divisions on there. We can combine the horizontal and vertical divisions, so we have 3 horizontal divisions with 1 vertical division, and it just figures out all of that geometry for you. Modify the frame thickness and the colors, of course, as well as the finish on that. So with all those settings, you should be able to come up with a wall with a built-in screen that meets your needs. Oh, I forgot to cover the offset on this. So in sickbay, I think the screen is centered in this cutout, in the wall cutout. In engineering, we have the wall set out closer to the edge of the hole, so we can bring that out. We can even bring it out beyond the thickness of the wall. But if it's set back just a little distance, we can control that with this offset slider. All right, that's the wall with screen. It takes care of all of our walls. I'm going to bring out another wall just so we can show off the wall widgets here. Again, in our assets browser, we go to wall widgets, and I've got these divided up into corridor wall widgets, decor, which we typically find inside individual rooms, and then service and engineering widgets. There's quite a bit more to be added, particularly to service and engineering. I'll add those when I get to the engineering sections. Quite a bit more to do also in decor. I want to have a wall hanging where you can import your own image file and have that as a wall hanging if you want to do that. But certainly the most complete so far are the corridor wall widgets, is what I focused on. These are designed to not be dragged out into the viewport. We can do that, but then it just lays it on the floor, and that went under the assets folder even though I had the top level scene collection selected. So if we drag out a wall widget and just drag it out into the viewport, it doesn't do as much good laying on the floor like that. So these are designed to be dragged directly from the asset browser onto a wall. And it might be kind of hard to see there. Bring it up into the red background there. So you can see it says Wallcom panel, and it draws in a kind of a bounding box showing you where that's going. And again, it went to the wrong collection. Now, for some reason, based on whether it is an orthogonal wall or a radial wall, that asset shows up either in the right orientation or the wrong orientation. So on a radial wall, it shows up in the correct orientation. On an orthogonal wall, it shows up in the improper orientation. You can change that by going into the Z angle and typing in 270 degrees, and it orients that properly. That's definitely something I will need to fix. Hopefully by the next time I come out with Asset Pack 2, that will be fixed. So for now, we've got this, and to show this doesn't look too great in material preview mode. If we go to shaded mode, it looks a lot better. So in this case, I've got the Wallcom panel. We've got the red alert that can be turned on and off, and I've got two settings underneath that: the brightness when it's off. So if we turn that all the way down to 0, it doesn't look very good at all. So I have a white color with very dimly lit, and with red alert on, that's a red color, and we can change the brightness of that. Also, the big red button, we can show it depressed or not, and the same thing with comms. We can turn comms off and turn them on. I've got a bulkhead picker. Let's just take that door out of the asset. So I took the door out of the asset just so we have a little bit of extra space to work with here. So we've got a bulkhead picker. Just drag that asset over roughly where you want it to go, and from here you can pick which kind of bulkhead you want to show there. So yeah, this was fun to model, but I hope that looks as screen accurate as possible. So from our geometry drop down, we have the bulkhead type. These have this kind of abstract names. I think some of these names I got from what was printed on an auction photo for that type of asset. Initially, this doesn't look good at all, but if we make the proper adjustments, we can make this however we want to look. So you have I selected that. That looks pretty awful, but that's why I've got these settings in here. So we will unclick default color. We'll change the paint color to whatever we want it to be. I've got a bulkhead red color in here, or we can put in any kind of custom color that we want, and again, change the paint finish there. So we've also got a backboard that we can turn on and off. Can control the width of the backboard and the height and the thickness and the color. Let's say we want that to be a medium gray, flat finish, and then we want our color to be a bulkhead red, and that's what we get there. So what else have we got? We've got this other one. Again, we can adjust the backboard size to be the appropriate size. Got that funky thing. We can give it a paint color, but if we want the default color, which shows off the different decals and stuff, we just click on default color. This one is intended to be yellowish and no backboard. And then what's the last one I have here? Oh yeah, that comes with the backboard. And again, we see here the artifacting that we have with the low poly model, but that'll smooth right out as soon as you render that with the camera. You have corridor signs. Should be pretty simple to use. These assets I have with this rotate 90 checkbox here, which is a necessary evil right now. I've wished I didn't need that. But as we bring those assets into a wall, if we're putting them on a radial wall, they come in the proper orientation. If I put that same asset onto an orthogonal wall, it comes in 90 degrees out of whack. So I've got this rotate 90 just to have a quick manual intervention there to straighten that out. We can type in any string we want in there, control the color of that, the text size. Oops, I suppose I need to highlight it first. We can control the text size. And the text box width, I think Blender needs to make some improvements here because there's a text box that you just do not see. The wider you make that, wraps the text around inside that text box, and you just have to make adjustments to that until the text comes out the way you want it to. I've got a toggle for narrow and normal font, defaults to narrow, and then I have width and height adjustments that you can manipulate there to make that thing any size that you want it to be. Also color and finish. Got this warning placard. If you got a plain rectangle, change the location, width, and height of that, and the color. Also got a square screen. Pretty self-explanatory there with width and height, depth, spacing. Let's jump to elevators, ladders, and stairs now. I've got a standalone triangular ladder and a wall-mounted ladder. The wall-mounted ladder is really designed to be put on a wall, of course, but you can just drop it in the viewport. You've got control over the width, depth, rung spacing, the rung count, whether or not you have standoffs on the top or bottom, the standoff spacing, just about every aspect of this thing you can change. The triangular ladder that we see in the engineering cylinder alcove, I don't have nearly as many customizations there because that's pretty much a fixed sized asset that goes in the middle of that cylindrical ladder. And all you can change here is the color. If you want other parameters with that, let me know. Here we got the ladder alcove. Now my alcove in my first iteration was pretty much a fixed asset. You couldn't really adjust much except for the ladder itself. But now you can change the width of the alcove, the depth, the color, of course, whether or not it has floor skirting, the back wall thickness, which is important because as this butts up on stage 9 to the briefing room, this was getting into the area of the briefing room, so I had to make that back wall thickness adjustable. Opening width, opening height, and that hex screen adjusts itself automatically for the height, and then the overall location left and right. You can change the color of the cutout if you want to. Can turn each of these elements on and off, the ladder, the hex screen. We can have corner cylinders on here too if we want them. Wall trim on and off. The circle grill is located up in here. You normally don't see that. You see it rarely in the original series, but more often you see the effects of the light coming through that. But you can turn that on and off. And inlay, you can turn on and off as well. And of course, this is commonly used in conjunction with a sign. Stick that in there just for kicks. We'll put on environmental personnel only. Make that like a 6-inch font. Let's go to 4 and change that sign color to red. And then we have a ladder alcove. Our cylindrical ladder we can drop right in there. But let's go through the settings here. We've got wall trim that includes wall color, whether we have trim on that cylindrical part on the inboard side. We've got trim board style and color. The ingress egress geometry, that's just a fancy way of saying how big is the hole I want to get into. So we have control over that opening size, and we also have control over the ladder orientation, as well as the scale of the texture on the inside. Depending on how big or small you want that to be, you can change that. We have a toggle for the wings, the walls that come out, whether you need those or not, that's up to you. This also has a symmetry setting, so it defaults to symmetrical. So if I change my wing length, wing angle, it's symmetrical. If I uncheck the symmetry, now I have independent control over the length and the angle of each of those walls, as well as the corner cylinders. So this was needed because depending on where you end up putting one of these, you could have adjoining walls coming in at all different directions and locations. So you need full control over those wings to do that. So the transition wall is simply the wall that makes the transition from the cylinder to the wings. So you have control over the length of that, and the angle, and the inlay adjustment. If you have inlay on there, you can adjust where that inlay is, or you can just move it out of the picture. Now, when I posted preview images of this on Facebook and the Trek BBS, I had one person named Henok, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He pointed out that the floor actually cut straight across this opening here. So this wasn't an entire cylinder, and that's visible in the episode of Doomsday Machine, probably other episodes as well. But I know in the official Star Trek series set tour, they have it the same way. So I've got that set to be toggled off if you want that to be completely round there, or to go straight across there to be screen accurate. So thanks to Henok for pointing that out. We can change the distance, how deep that goes into there to be only, going across the width of the opening to go a little further or anywhere in between. And then we have can change the color of that carpet. We haven't talked about carpet too much yet, but every time we deal with carpet, we can change the color of the carpet just like we do everywhere else. I'm going to make this fill in the entire hole. But as you see, as I make that carpet bigger and bigger, that pattern, the texture of the carpet gets larger and larger also. So with all of my carpet, I have this carpet pile scale setting to where you can increase and decrease it to make it a very fine scale so that it looks appropriately carpety from a distance to a larger scale. And this comes in when you're laying one piece of carpet asset next to another. You want those to be able to roughly match, so that's adjustable. On this update, we have dirt level, so we can add dirt to the carpet. It's on a scale from 0 to 10, 10 being the dirtiest, 0 being not so dirty. And then we can control the scale of that dirt as well. Crew quarters, pretty much the same. I did a crew quarters deep dive video, so I refer you to that video to see most of this stuff. But there have been a couple of changes. On the Trek BBS, another user named Thraxis called me out on this lazy Susan angle, going from 0 degrees to 120 degrees. We didn't see this on very many episodes, especially in motion, but typically we saw these drawers in this cabinet. I think in the Tholian web, it was set out as Uhura's quarters. We see this set up here, and then we see it, I think, transition to the drawers, which I think is a pretty clever design. Now, the third setting, I don't think we ever saw what might have been inside there, so I made it wide open like this just in case if you had some hangers up here with your dress uniforms hanging from there. But in any case, I left that wide open. But a user on the Trek BBS named Thraxis said that should be filled in if we want to be screen accurate. And he pointed me to the episode, The Enemy Within, Yeoman Rand's quarters, where it was set up like this. And then she touched that and rotated it to open up to these drawers. So to be screen accurate, I put in that filler panel, but then I also added a toggle to turn that on or off, depending on your needs and what you want to do with that space. So thanks to Thraxis for pointing that out. Other updates here, we don't see a lot of detail yet because buttons and lights is a whole new set of assets that I'm going to be updating. Again, I have all of those created now, but I want to make sure they're completely up to date before I get those released. But the basic shapes and sliding doors for both the safe and the food replicator I have done. What I didn't have before, and then if we bring this back to 0, I can bring out each drawer one at a time to slide out and back in. So what I didn't have before on these, the safe and the food replicator, let's take a look at the safe first. It was in a fixed position and you could slide the door open and close, but didn't have much control over that other than that. So with this, you can turn the safe off or have it on if you want to include that. You can change the location of it now, horizontally, vertically. You can change the width and the depth and the height. The door slide is controlled just like with the corridor doors from 0 to 1, so you can just bang that against one extreme or the other. You can change it from a horizontal or vertical slide. You can also change the positive or negative aspect of that slide, so it slides up instead of down or right instead of left. So complete control over that thing. And then lastly, we have the color of the glow inside. If you want to have a kind of a highlight glow inside there, you have control over the glow color and the strength as well. Same thing with the food replicator. But I'll be adding more detail. So we have a panel of buttons and lights above the safe on that side, as well as the data card slot and 4 indicator lights and some text on the food replicator that I'll be adding in a future update. Now this divider wall here also has the capability to integrate in the corridor walls here. And that's to just make things a little simpler to set up when you have some radial walls that come in. And instead of having those independent and having to adjust those separately, I built those in. But if you want to add those separately, you can just turn the corridor walls off. And you could just have your corridor come up here and put those in individually if you want. But if you want to use the integrated ones, you just turn those on or off. The nice thing about having that integrated, if we go to like a radial layout, it changes to the radial walls. And it looks like it kind of crapped out there, but it didn't. We can change the location of the bedroom door there. And those are all built in like that. So you can see as this faces outward from the center, you can see the radius of the corridor here. Now, if we take this asset and flip it to inboard, it automatically adjusts those walls to have a concave aspect rather than a convex. And all we have to do here is, rather than recreate all those walls, is we have just a single tweak to the filler wall start angle to line that up there. And that's done. We don't have to mess around with laying individual walls in there separately. We also have control of how many panels we want in the center there. 1, 2, 3, 4. I usually find that 1 or 2 fits that in pretty well. Door controls, as usual, door chime fills that whole section out. Then we have the crew quarters back wall. This is pretty simple. I covered all of this in the crew quarters deep dive, so no real changes there other than it's simpler now. It's a little more robust, and I took out all of the shelf and tabletop items from being in the asset itself to being drag and drop now. Okay, lastly we have flooring. I'm not going to do a deep dive into that now, but there's probably a separate video to be made on that. Drag the flooring out here, pull it out of the wrong collection because Blender. And there we have our flooring. Now this is a pretty thick chunk of flooring here, and this is from Jimbo Titus's scaled up heavy cruiser blueprints, and the floor is 27 inches thick, but that of course with everything else can be modified. So before we dive into materials and stuff, we have control over the basic geometry. The three different types of floors. We have a linear floor where you control the length, width, and the thickness. Actually, all the floors we control the thickness. We have an arc, just has a start angle and end angle, inside and outside radius. And we have a full circle. Also inside, outside radius. We can bring the inside radius all the way down to 0 if we want, so, and then that'll give us just a disk. And then we can turn the carpet on and off. If we remove the carpet, the wall thickness remains the same. So the carpet, if we give that a maximum carpet thickness of 1, as an example, we look at the cross section here. We got 27 inches, the first top inch being taken up by the carpet. If we turn the carpet off, the floor will automatically rise up to fill that 1 inch that was removed from the carpet. We've got the pile scale, as we had mentioned previously. The smaller the number, the finer the pile. Color. Again, a drop-down selection of colors, common carpet colors, as well as a custom color wheel if you want to do that way. And as described before, the dirt level from 1 to 10 and the dirt scale. So the floor we have also can change the material of the floor. Take the carpet out. I've got this set to the engineering floor, which is a semi-gloss gray. But we can also make it a paint color of any color that we want there. If we uncheck both carpet and floor, it just disappears because we don't have carpet or floor. I didn't want this to be a failure mode, but I mean, it's possible to do this and have a user wonder, what the heck, I've got my floor here, but it's not there. So make sure you have either carpet or floor or both turned on. The reason I said it that way, sometimes you just want a floor without carpet. Sometimes you just want a carpet without floor, like those carpet strips we see in the curved corridor. So that's why that's set up like that. Now, this will be for another video, but I have a whole another part of this menu drop down for Booleans, and I'll go into that briefly here, but I want to go into that in a little more depth later. We'll change this carpet to red. We're going to take that dirt level down and pretend we're working on the transporter pad here. And I'm going to use this Boolean setting for that. So I want to check that on. And a Boolean is nothing more than a geometric shape that we use as a cutting tool to cut into another shape. So I've got the option for 2 Booleans here. And for the transporter pad, we just need 1 Boolean. And so I'm going to turn that on. And you see it's done something already here. It's cut out a wedge out of this thing. We see a little artifacting on the edge there because of the dimensions of that are exactly the same outside diameter as our parent material. But if I want to see what's going on there a little bit more clearly, I can click on the Show Booleans checkbox and I see the geometry of my cutout. And you see why that's given us some artifacts here, because it is the exact same outside radius. Now my settings for the Booleans are almost exactly identical to the settings for the floor itself. In other words, I have location, orientation, array, and then the geometry, arc, full circle, and linear. If I change this outside radius of this thing and hide my Booleans again, those artifacts disappear because now there's plenty of overlap there. If I change my Boolean to a full circle, see it did something unexpected there until I show my Booleans, and I can see I've got a big donut here that's cutting away everything except for the donut hole there. If I change some of those parameters, inside radius of 0, outside radius of 50, so there's my Boolean now, and if I hide that, now I've got a hole in there. And lastly, if I go to a linear, I've got a rectangular cutout that's defined by width and length. So let's go back to full circle. Let's change the diameter 36-inch radius there. And then a radius, let's set that off from center by, say, 100 inches or more. And let's make this a pattern. Let's make this an array. We'll give it a resolution of 6. And then the appropriate sweep angle, and that's going goofy because we have all these Booleans overlapping each other, but as they clear away from each other, you can see it's cleaned up quite a bit. And if we punch in 300 degrees here, we have 6 equally spaced holes in there. And there's the beginnings of our transporter pad. So the flooring is really quite flexible, especially once you throw in those Booleans. You can make just about any size and shape of floor that you need in your set construction. We'll turn those back off. So that's it for today. I'll have to say, I've had help from the community in pointing out areas where it wasn't quite screen accurate, and I really appreciate that feedback. So if you have that kind of feedback, give that to me. Also, if you have glitches or bugs that you found, let me know that as well. If you click a box on or off, it does something unexpected or something's kind of freaking out on you, I want to know that as well. I have a limited bandwidth, so I don't know if I'll be able to address general questions about how does Blender work, because it can be a very complicated software with a steep learning curve. And hopefully by providing these assets and limiting what you have to work with to primarily this modifier panel here and a few of the visibility parameters up here, you can get by with this asset pack. But if you have more questions about how Blender works in general, I encourage you to visit any one of the many really good tutorial videos out there and spend some time and work through that. Even if elements of that tutorial do not apply directly to what you're doing, it still gives you some familiarity and time with Blender so that you become more comfortable with it. And with that, I'll sign off for now. Hopefully the next asset pack will be available in roughly a month or so. That'll be furniture, and I'm hoping to have tabletop items included in that as well. And we'll talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.